There's a curriculum, I forgot what it was called, but it's through the UUA Tapestry of Faith, and in that curriculum, they have this wonderful graphic of the principles as an archway. And the foundation stones of the archway are our first and last principle: inherent worth and dignity of all people, and the interconnected web of all existence. And then each of the other principles are built upon those until you get to the keystone. The thing that makes the arch possible is the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So they are clearly, at least in this graphic, and I think in actual practice, key to our faith tradition, but they are also somewhat contradictory. Freedom seems to me to be about the disintegration of limits, and responsibility is rather the embracing of obligation and duty, or in other words, responsibility is the integration of limits. So that makes a free and responsible search for truth and meaning the pairing of opposites. And how that got through committee, I'll never know. These were written in committee. So is the Old Testament. And there's a lot of wisdom in both of these documents. I mean, the Old Testament editors made the decision to keep some extremely contradictory things in that canon. They seem to realize that in that contradiction is some wisdom. And here too, in our own principles, I hope that we may have a case where contradiction yields wisdom. But before we celebrate ourselves, let's do a little investigation. So what is human freedom? I mean, I'm not going to give you the sermon about freedom. You need freedom to have responsibility. You all know that. That would be really boring. We're going to go a little bit different direction. I want to think about what is freedom. What is human freedom? And as I thought about it, I started to come up with three broad categories that are distinct from one another, but at the peripheries, they have some blending. I came up with political freedom, freedom of agency, otherwise known as free will, and spiritual freedom. So we'll talk about political freedom first. Say there is someone who is oppressed, a slave, someone who is by political definition entirely unfree. She is told what to do. She is assigned a responsibility. She is prescribed a schedule and a diet. But one day this person rises up and either escapes from or destroys the political system that held her in bondage. In her new life, she chooses what to do, what to be responsible for and to, and she sets her own schedule and eats what she wishes so far as it is available and affordable given her other choices that she makes. So she is free. But this is not absolute freedom. Freedom is one of those tricky words. It's a pure word. If it is mitigated in any way, does it cease to exist? One can be more free than one was, but does that mean that one is free? In our example, the freedom of the woman would be contingent still on so many factors, on what kind of work was available. Is work available? Is she given compensation in line with the quality of her work and the cost of living? And what are the factors that go into the cost of living? What food is available? What set of choices and restrictions is she operating in? So this is not true freedom. This is a relative freedom. And I don't mean to denigrate it. It is absolutely crucial. It is worth dying for. Certainly people have died for it. Still, this is political freedom, and it's really quite limited. It's preferable to the contrary by a long way, but it has limits. And some of those limits are beyond local control, pointing to the interconnected web of our experience, right? So say a tsunami wipes out a power plant, affecting the economy and lifestyles for those both within sight of the disaster and those across an ocean. So we are limited beyond our power to choose. And now we approach the point where the categories of political freedom and freedom of agency start to blur into one another. So freedom of agency takes political freedom one step more abstract. And this is where we come upon the question of free will, something that our culture and our tradition holds in high regard. But here we also encounter a huge paradox in the center of our faith. The interconnected web of all existence. Every node of existence is connected at every conceivable angle to other nodes of existence, which are in turn connected at every conceivable angle to other nodes of existence, and on ad infinitum. And so that if you pull on a string on a connective tissue over here, it affects something over here. And all the time, things are being pulled on. So it is one giant clockwork, interconnected clockwork of interdependency. And in that, where is there room for free will? And yet we affirm both in our principles. And it's not just philosophical speculation that gives rise to questions concerning free will. There's a whole ream of social scientific studies that really dispute the notion. My favorite one, I forgot who penned it, I forgot when it was done, but I will relate it as, you can call it hearsay and then Google it when you get home and confirm it. The experiment was a grad student was out here with a bunch of papers and a cup of coffee, and they would walk up to random people and say, could I interview you for my class or a science experiment or whatever? They would introduce themselves, and the person would say yes, and they would say, I'm just going to show you a picture. I want you to tell me if you like this guy or not. But I can't, it's like buried in their reams of paper. They can't get to it because they got their hands full. So they hand a cup of coffee to the person that they're interviewing. They find the picture. They show the person the picture. They say, do you like Joe or not? Yes or no? And the person answers yes or no. And they put their picture away, take their cup of coffee back, say thank you, send them on their way. The overwhelming amount of people who got a cold cup of coffee didn't like Joe. The overwhelming amount of people who got a warm cup of coffee liked Joe. So the takeaway from that is that our decisions are happening at a preconscious level, that we're actually acting before we are aware of our acting. And then in fact, what we call free will is oftentimes simply a justification of what we just did. A justification of decisions that are instinctual, genetic, contextual, but very little intentional. And this is just, one of many, many, many such experiments. So it seems that we have very little free will. So how is it then that a free and responsible search for truth and meaning has any legitimacy? I'll let you think about that with Jane. So that we don't get swept along by the coffee in our thinking about Joe. We pause our reactivity. We observe ourselves. Recall the words of Viktor Frankl, who observed that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response, he says, lies our growth and our freedom. That's an ability. It's an ability that can be practiced and developed. It is not easy, but it can be practiced and developed. It is the ability to cultivate a non-reactive space in order to respond from our non-contingent center. Connected but not reactive. We might call this ability to respond responsibility. The ability to respond. So if spiritual growth is about increasing connections, responsibility then is the connective tissue of spirituality. Responsibility is the medium of the Spirit. It is the stuff in which the Spirit takes action. Not flesh so much as response. Responsibility is relational. It is a connection. Your ability to respond. And connection is a spiritual opportunity, a spiritual experience being called into connection beyond what we think we are. That's what I've said from this place many times. It's what I believe. And these connections are not imaginary. They are you in relationship to all that creates you, to all that creates your context. Connections are you in relationship to your world and all its pieces, all your roles. Your connections are you in relation to every living being you encounter, every node of existence that you encounter. And if those connections are corrupt, if they are able to be leveraged against you, freedom, true freedom, will elude you. If you crave them too much, cling to them too much, are afraid of losing them or avoid them, spiritual freedom will elude you, and freedom will elude you. Free will and political freedom, relative as they are only possible in the end through spiritual freedom. So recall the example of the slave woman. To make the change that she made, to make that decision, she had to have courage. And we've wondered before, where does such a courage come from? I feel that it's rooted in a fearlessness that is itself ultimately rooted in the non-contingent quality of self. Something compels you to get to that nugget, that seed of non-contingent being from where action can rightly be taken. That part of us that is not connected to a smooth service. I'm not perturbed right now. I'm 2,000 leagues. Yeah, we want to cultivate that part of us that is fearlessly connected, where we are deeply connected, but not clinging, not afraid to lose all that we love, and even our very lives. That's freedom. And responding to oppression of any kind from this space is the point where freedom and responsibility are no longer opposites, but are indeed one and the same. And this is our seed, imparted by the grace of our whole lives, and planted by us in our every response. Let us cultivate that.